great to hear your remarks. And thinking back on 20 years, if you were to describe, as you said, a complicated time for the last 20 years between Iraq and the US, how would you describe Iraq today?
Maybe not. Oh, there we go. So I think, first of all, I would describe it as looking forward, right? There are a lot of folks that want to look back and want to go back through the last 20 years and ask you to rewind the tape. I mean, happy to do that personally. I'll do that over lunch. But really what I'm interested in highlighting is some of the things I mentioned, which are about Iraq's future. It's about a stable, secure Iraq so that you have the opportunity to create jobs, to deal with the economic challenges, and to take on some of the climate issues that you heard the Prime Minister talk about. And hopefully that will be reflected in the budget, as he said, in ways that meet the needs of the Iraqi people.
And in May 2003, there was that very famous image of President Bush speaking and declaring the major combat missions in Iraq over. And even though he didn't say the term mission accomplished, it was on a banner behind him. And
I remember.
Those of us journalists don't forget these things, and I'm sure a lot of officials and diplomats remember it. Has the mission been accomplished?
I mean, I think the mission has gone through different transitional phases, and I can remember that really well. On that particular day, I happened to be in the UN compound just off the Canal Street in Baghdad, and I can remember seeing that scene and saying, it seems to me there's a lot of work that still has to be done here. But I also accept the fact that presidents and leaders of nations make statements because they're sending signals to their population and to the international community in general. I think the real issue, though, is how Iraq moves through this next transition phase. And so the Prime Minister talked about, and others have talked about, needing some time, right. Have only been in position for a certain number of months. And it strikes me at times that we are unreasonable, our expectations are unreasonable of what we expect when leaders enter these transition phases and have to reshape things. The Prime Minister laid out an incredible agenda this morning, in my opinion. And so the task is, can he get the operating space, not only from the Iraqi people, but from Iraq in general, to be able to deliver on that broad agenda? And that's the question. How do we deal with the transition phase that now the government finds itself in?
I promise this is the last question about the past, and then we're going to discuss
okay.
The Prime Minister's agenda and also the Iraqi future and how the U.S. can help it. But just, I wanted to ask you about what Peter Bergen said in a previous panel, where he said there hasn't been enough self-reflection in the U.S. Do you agree with that? Do you think there has been self-reflection?
I disagree with Peter a little bit in this. I think there's been an incredible amount of self-reflection. I think it's happened at a lot of different levels. In fact, I would argue that it's happened across American administrations. We're in a much different place about how we have looked at Iraq and the challenges that the region is dealing now. The region's in a different place. You know, when I go back and look at how the region appeared 10 years ago, even at the beginning of the Daesh period in 2013 and 14, we look very different now here. And you can feel it and you can see it. I also think that the campaign that was put together to fight Daesh back in the 2014, 15, and 16 timeframe reflected a lot of the lessons learned from our experiences here with the Iraqis dealing with al-Qaeda. And so what we saw was a very different enemy, and we also saw a different requirement, both from a military perspective to help the Iraqi security forces and then what became the Syrian Democratic Forces deal with the Daesh threat. Very different than what we were trying to do back in 2003, 4, 5, and 6. So of course we've changed. I think any American who has been on this journey, whether in uniform or wearing the clothes of a diplomat or a provider, have also learned an enormous amount. Now, and the same thing has happened, I also believe, with Iraqis. People are in very different positions in different places now in terms of how they look at these challenges. So I disagree with Peter in that we're not a learning organization. That's not what he meant when he answered the question, I don't believe. But at the same time, I do think that, you know, a fair bit of introspection is required. And I think when I talked about kind of the emerging Biden doctrine and those 5 principles, it does also reflect the fact that the United States has learned an enormous amount as well.
So, you know, you talk about, of course, those different security moments and the transition that Iraq at the moment is witnessing. And of course, a very ambitious agenda for this current government. Previously, we used to say, without enough stability and security, nothing else can move forward. And now there's increasingly an understanding that unless you tackle the climate issues, economy, getting people into jobs, the security of the country can always be vulnerable. So I wanted to ask you first about the security situation. You served 3 tours in Iraq, and Iraq has had different security challenges at different times. How would you assess the security situation today?
Incredibly stable. So I salute the Iraqi security forces for that effort. As was highlighted, though, Daesh is not gone. The UN, did their normal quarterly or 6-month report in which they report back to the Security Council on violent extremists across the world. The number, that they categorized was somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000, of which probably 5,000 were fighters. That's in Syria and Iraq. I've heard reports from Iraqi security forces saying the number is perhaps 5,000. I think what's critically important is that the Iraqi security forces have the capability and capacity to continue to wage the fight against Daesh. And what the United States and the global coalition continue to do are help in some very, very simple ways, and provide, in some cases, assist with some enablers. But the Iraqi security forces are able to keep the pressure on Daesh, and that's incredibly important.
One of the concerns that Iraq has is that a new wave of extremists could emerge from the continued camps holding ISIS family members. Of course, much of this is in Syria. Iraq has taken a huge burden and repatriated some, still has a long way to go, but has worked at this. What about other countries, the responsibility of other countries to repatriate their citizens?
So there are two distinct problems. The first problem is there are about 10,000 Daesh detainees. Okay, those are fighting men that fought against either the Syrian Democratic Forces or on the border that are locked up in prisons and holding facilities. That's one problem. The second problem are the displaced women and children that are in the Al-Hol camp, as one example. And so there are about 50,000 women and children. There's some men, but only a small number there. And the largest, if you look at the 50,000, about 20,000 are Iraqis, about 20,000 are Syrians, and probably 10,000 are from other countries. As was already highlighted, getting nations to repatriate their citizens is an incredibly difficult problem for a whole host of reasons.
Right.
The Iraq problem is also difficult because you have to bring those displaced people back to Iraq, and then Iraq has to figure out how to repatriate them and figure out where to resettle them in communities back here. And there's still a stigma from, in many cases, the perception that those women and their families supported Daesh and did horrific things to the Iraqi communities. The Syrian problem was more complicated because what do you do with almost half the population, which are Syrians? Do you give them to the Assad regime? Do you just let them go? And getting them resettled back into their homes is difficult when they cannot go home, and other people may be living there. So it's an incredibly complicated three-set problem that is easy to say nations should just go do X, Y, and Z. But if it was easy, they would have been done. We've been working on this now since 2017, early 2018. We've had some successes getting those 10,000 repatriated, but it's a difficult problem for nations to tackle.
Now, another source of instability for Iraq and concern when it comes to security is also some militia groups. So what's your assessment now in terms of the different militia groupings that exist in Iraq, and do you think they pose a threat to the stability of the country?
I think the Prime Minister laid out the challenge really well and how he's going to deal with it, and I think the Iraqi people have to hold the government of Iraq responsible to do it exactly like the Prime Minister said. And so when Secretary Austin was here barely a week or so ago, he and the Defense Minister talked a bit about that, and it's the issue that the American forces and the coalition, which are here under NATO training mission Iraq, have a belief that we will not be attacked by militia groups. Shouldn't be a big surprise. It seems to be a condition for support.
Now, if we talk about support, of course, the continued presence of U.S. troops. Is this primarily a political statement to ensure that people believe the U.S. continues to be committed to Iraq, in addition, of course, to the importance of the advise and assist role that they do?
So first and foremost, it's the advise and assist role. We've been invited by the government of Iraq. And so that's the condition in which American forces and the NATO mission stay, that the invitation from the government remains firm. And so with that invitation then comes the effort to advise and assist, as you highlighted.
Another ask, let's say, from Iraq is for the U.S. to help in the issue of corruption. We just heard from Prime Minister Sudani call corruption a pandemic, and he needs to come up with the vaccine to deal with it. How can the U.S. help, especially in terms of returning funds that have been siphoned out from the country, particularly as much of those funds are in U.S. dollars?
Well, there have been a series of measures that have been undertaken to try to help with, again, the movement of money outside of the country through the Central Bank of New York, and David will talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. Suffice to say, it's the Iraqi people's money, and so if it is being moved out of the country illegally, the problem is it's not going for the betterment of the Iraqi people. And it's also about, as you heard earlier, it's about investor confidence. So if there's no belief that you can make an investment in Iraqi businesses without fear of it departing, the investment climate becomes really negative, and countries are unwilling to put forth investments, which doesn't spur private business the way everyone seeks for it to occur.
So would you say today there is more confidence in the investor climate in Iraq?
I think it's moving slowly in a positive direction. I think the Prime Minister's efforts are going to be critical to how, private corporations, they come in and do assessments, and they determine whether they want to invest here. And it's about both public and private confidence that there is a climate that's worthy of continuing to bring jobs here.
So some of that confidence was rocked earlier in the year when there were concerns about the Iraqi currency. We had His Excellency the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister come to Washington and have very important meetings regarding those relationships and the economic situation. Are you confident that now the steps that were sought after are being taken that can allow the Iraqi currency to continue to be stable and not have these issues when it comes to the US dollar?
I am, but there's more steps that have to be taken. So the starting point, we've crossed the starting line, and there are a whole series of additional measures that the government of Iraq is to continue to follow through on.
Okay, I want to talk now more regionally. You spoke on at the podium about the U.S. not being disengaged in the region, and yet people are not convinced. And so you have to repeat the statement. I have to say, when we saw the news of the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement and reestablishment of relations happening in Beijing, a lot of people were asking questions about the U.S. and its role. How did you receive that news?
First of all, we had talked about kind of the efforts that started in Baghdad to facilitate Iraq's role in some regional integration and regional efforts as being incredibly helpful and important. So it seems to me people ought to be patting the Iraqis on the back for starting a process that led to last Friday's result. In Washington, D.C., it was being played as a zero-sum game. In other words, the Chinese were able to work with the Iranians and others in the Saudis, and they inked an agreement.
Right.
And that means the United States came out the loser. We just don't see it that way. And again, I talked about diplomacy, I talked about integration, and it seems to me that that's exactly what we wanted to see occur. So I'm encouraged by it, and if it kind of lessens tensions, if the Iranians agree to stop supplying the Houthis with weapons, that's good. There have been at least 3 major shipments that have been interdicted in the last 6 months. So I would be encouraged by that. So that's good, and we'll just see where it goes, and let's hope that that the Chinese brokered agreement delivers in the next 2 months based on what was stated in the document they all signed.
Can that agreement help with the JCPOA, or are we too far gone now from getting that agreement signed?
The way I think you look at the JCPOA, the document itself, is that there was an agreement put on the table last March. It was generally a pretty good proposal, and the Iranians walked away from it. And so that proposal is still on the table.
The proposal continues to be on the table.
It's still on the table. And so, we've kind of said to, through the E3 and others that it's still on the table in our minds. We'll go work on some other things. And there are a whole host of other Iranian challenges that we have had to kind of confront. One of the challenges is the provision of Iranian unmanned UAVs, which are turning the lights out in Kyiv and all over the country of the Ukraine. That's concerning. Additionally, the proliferation and the movement of some equipment from Russia to Iran. It's multifaceted. It's the violating of sanctions that the UN and others have agreed to, adhere to. If you remember, last fall there were threats by Iran to attack Saudi Arabia. And the Houthis did attack Saudi Arabia, Aramco, and they did attack the Emirates. So again, I just kind of put the facts on the table and say there are some Iran challenges that the United States is incredibly concerned about. And JCPOA and the nuclear portfolio is another one of those, and we'll just see where it goes over time.
Another portfolio that Iraq is very concerned about also comes when it comes to climate and the issue of water flows, Turkey and Iran both being instrumental in that. How do you see the regional dynamic? If we talk about climate change being a major issue and climate action being top of the agenda for President Biden, but also for Prime Minister Soudani and the government here, how can we get regional order to help with the water scarcity issue?
I mean, on the last panel talked about kind of migration versus adaptation, and I think that's an interesting way of looking at the problem set. We just finished COP27, done at Sharm el-Sheikh, hosted by the Egyptians. President Biden was there. A number of, special envoy for climate Kerry was there. I know others will talk about in the next day. And there were a whole series of proposals that were put on the table. Nations have to meet their commitments. And so as we move into COP28, which will be hosted at the Emirates, I mean, there's lots of work already. The Emiratis just visited Washington last week, met with Kerry and others, and had some more fulsome discussions about other things the United States could continue to help do. So I think the jury's still out. It's easy for nations to make promises. The question is, can they fulfill those commitments?
Right. My very last question to you, and then we will allow you all to go to lunch. Our very last question, what do you see as Iraq's greatest opportunity looking forward?
Well, first of all, I'm basing it on the assumption that the security situation remains calm, right? Because that's the foundation which I really think everything rests upon. It seems to me it's economic opportunity. And I just think that with this magnificent population of young men and women that are looking for opportunity, that think differently than people of my generation, they are seeking a chance to make their way, find jobs, and then not necessarily jobs in the public sector either, but they're looking for opportunity, and they're thinking of unique ways to do it. And I think the challenge for Iraq's leaders, people in this room, are to help them fulfill those goals and to create some of these opportunities that they seek. And I'm hopeful for that. And that, as I close, my last comment would be, I've always been optimistic about Iraq, and even in the darkest of days. And I'll use one small vignette. My first trip up to the Kurdish region back in 2006, when you could feel things coming unraveled in Baghdad and in the Baghdad belts. I came up to visit the Iraqi military academy up in the Kurdish region, and we went over for dinner in Zaka. And the thing that struck me, besides the great food and the wonderful hospitality, was people were painting their houses. And you never saw that in Baghdad. Everything was dreary down in Baghdad. But up in Zaka, they were painting their new houses that are being constructed. They were painting them the color of Italian ice. So you had sherbet color being painted. And I couldn't think of a more unique sign of optimism, even in the dark, what I thought were the darkest days of what Iraq was going through in that transition period. People don't paint their homes if they don't have confidence that they'll be able to live in them and they'll retain their value. So I've been incredibly optimistic about Iraq, and I look forward to engaging others at break time and in other periods to continue this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. When you come to AUIS, that's when you're filled with hope. So thank you for joining us in AUIS.
Thank you.